Welcome to Black History Matters 2022, presented by the National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum, also known as NAHOF, located in Peterborough, New York. Black History Matters is an educational series that seeks to highlight historical events in the Black American experience. This series consists of 28 videos that NAHOF will release daily through the month of February 2022. Videos are viewable on NAHOF's website. The mission of the National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum is to honor anti-slavery abolitionists, their work to end slavery, and the legacy of that struggle, and strive to complete the second and ongoing abolition, the moral conviction to end racism. This program was funded in part by Humanities New York, with support from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of the National Endowment for the Humanities. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Jeffery McArn. Jeffery McArn has been Hamilton's college chaplain since 1996, when he was ordained as a minister in the Presbyterian Church. He has also served as summer minister for a small church on Grindstone Island in St. Lawrence River since 2005. A native of Laurinburg, North Carolina, Jeff is a graduate of Davidson College and Harvard Divinity School. Jeff works with both the Protestant chapel community and the interfaith community on campus, and he also works in local community outreach initiatives and service learning with the Hamilton College COOP. Jeff has taught classes on the art of listening, conflict resolution, and 1968. He currently teaches American freedom and religious thought. I'd like to welcome Jeffery McArn to begin his presentation.
Hello, my name is Jeff McArn. I serve as college chaplain here at Hamilton College, where Bob Moses was a student, matriculating here in 1952. He died on July 25th this past summer, and this is being recorded in January of 2022, when he would have been celebrating his 87th birthday on January 23rd. I'm speaking to you from the Hamilton College Chapel, where all young undergraduates in the 1950s would have spent time on a variety of occasions, including weekly compulsory chapel. We at Hamilton are proud to count Bob Moses as one of our most prominent alums, even though our pride is tempered by the uneven experience he had here. He was an impressive member of his class, philosophy major, captain of the varsity basketball team, vice president of his class, president of the philosophy club, member of the selective honorary society Doers and Thinkers, sang in the college choir. But he was one of two black men in his class, which disqualified him from the 10 Greek letter fraternities which dominated our college at that time. He did become a member of a non-Greek private society, the Emerson Literary Society, but in Moses' own words, quote, "I was never really comfortable with the whole social setup," end quote. Here is Bob Moses describing his educational life.
I had been raised in Harlem in the projects, Harlem River houses, which was at that time, certainly for me, a kind of ideal place to grow up. And so we had a community of people there. I could, run outside anytime during the day and play they had taken 3 city blocks to make one part of the projects, and the other part was over near the Harlem River. It was right across the river from the Yankee Stadium. I went to PS 90, which was the projects were on 151st Street, and PS 90 was on 48th. So it was a short walk to elementary school. And when I graduated, which was 1947. I was a January baby, and they were still taking kids in the middle of the school year. It was right after World War II, and the country had gone on a talent hunt, right? And they, as part of it, they set up a program to complete junior high school in 2.5 years instead of 3. And so they grabbed 1 or 2 students from every 6th grade class in Harlem and the South Bronx and put us all together in one class at Stitt Junior High School, which was up on the edge of Harlem, 164th Street and Edgecombe Avenue, on the avenue that overlooked the Polo Grounds. The Harlem River houses actually were between the Yankee Stadium and the Polo Grounds, right? And so we got extra teaching and extra teachers in that class. I remember I had someone from Germany who taught us algebra. My brother had gone to Stuyvesant. He was a year and a few months older than I, and so I had to do everything he did at that age. And so I took the test and went to Stuyvesant. So PS 90, of course, was all black. The Stitt Junior High School was all black except for our class. I think the reason they put it up there on the edge of Harlem was so that a couple of white kids, there were 2 white girls and 1 white boy, who were in our class. Right? Then I go to Stuyvesant and it's all white. You can count on the fingers of 2 hands the black kids at that time I think Stuyvesant had about 3,000 kids. Well, I played basketball with the Harlem Y. All right, I went up through the Harlem Y from the time I was in elementary school right on into high school with what they call the midgets and the cubs and the juniors, different age groups, right? And then I didn't want to go south. I didn't want to go to an HBCU. South was segregated. My father's uncle was teaching at Hampton. We had visited sometimes down there. And I wanted to play ball, so I picked a couple of small colleges to see whether I could get in and also play ball. And so I got into Hamilton and spent 4 years at Hamilton, and then got a fellowship to study at Harvard in philosophy. So I graduated high school 52, college 56. At Harvard, I was able to take the 8 courses and the preliminary exam for the PhD. I didn't pass it for the PhD, but apparently I passed it enough so that I qualified to get an MA. And I had taken a lot of French in college, and I took French in high school, and I had spent some time in France with the Quakers while I was in college in the summers. And so I took the language exam that first year at Harvard. And so at the end of 57, I got this MA. And then the next year, my mother passed, and I left. I was actually getting ready to go back when I got a phone call. My father had been hospitalized. So I ended up at Horace Mann. So when the sit-ins broke out in 1960, I was teaching school at the Horseman School in New York, and my uncle, my father's brother, Uncle Bill, was a professor at Hampton, and I knew that I had to go down and take a look at what was going on. The students at Hampton were demonstrating in Newport News, and Wyatt T. Walker, who was a minister at that time in Petersburg and later became the executive director of SCLC, King's organization, he came down to do the mass meeting and announced that King was going to set up an office in Harlem. And so I got all the information and made it to the organizing meeting of that Harlem office. And so Bayard Rustin was running that office. Bayard, remember, did the March on Washington with A. Philip Randolph. And so I would go down every day after school, and after they had the big fundraising, Harry Belafonte and Sidney Poitier headlined a fundraising at the 369th Armory. And my father actually worked there as one of the janitors. And after they did the fundraiser, I asked Bayard if I could go down and work with King. I thought King was still in Alabama. And Bayard sent me to Ella Baker, and Ella at that time was the director of SCLC. And it was in Ella's office that I learned about SNCC. Jane Stembridge, who was a young theological student, white, from Virginia, who had been at Union Theological Seminary in New York and went to the meeting that Ella called at Shore University that became the organizing place for SNCC, had gotten along very well with Ella, and she had volunteered to sort of be the first office person for SNCC. They decided they were going to hold the first Southwide meeting of SNCC in the fall of 1960. And Jane said, well, we don't have any information from Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. And so she got together with Ella. Ella knew everybody who had done anything across the South. And they made up a list of people, put me on the Greyhound bus, and I went scouting for SNCC. This is the summer of 1960. When I hit Cleveland, I met Amzie Moore. Amzie was on Ella's list, and he was the head of the NACP, and he was the one who told us what we should do, that we should come into Mississippi and do voter registration, not do direct action and public accommodations. And so I had a year to go on my contract, and I told Amzie, well, I want to come back and work for SNCC on your voter registration project. Okay, in the summer of 1960, I was on a trip for SNCC and going through Mississippi, and Ella Baker had written ahead to Amzie Moore, and I stopped in to see him in Cleveland, Mississippi. And Amzie laid out really what was a voter registration project for the Delta of Mississippi, and he wanted SNCC to come in and do it. In fact, he was the only person in the leadership of the NACP that I met at that time that was willing to welcome SNCC. And so I agreed to come back and help on that project.
I went back to teach for a year and came back in '61. Well, then, couldn't get started in Cleveland. I came down to Macomb. And in the course of that drive, some farmers from the neighboring county, Amite County, came out, and we began taking people there. And one
farmers being Negro farmers?
Negro farmers. And once I was attacked on the way to the courthouse. There were two farmers and myself.
With people to register?
We were going up to register and walking along the main street in the town, and three white young fellows came up, and one of them began to pick an argument, and then they had singled me out and began to beat on me, and I had about, I guess, 8 stitches on top of my head.
We don't with a fist or with a...
Well, apparently it turned
nuts?
out later that he had a knife, which was closed.
Using that as a kind of
Using it as a
bludgeon.
bludgeon. We went to trial with him. A couple of days later, he was acquitted.
And was beaten by Billy Jack Caston, who was the son-in-law of the local sheriff and son-in-law of state legislator E.H. Hurst. And then Bob Moses did a surprising thing. He filed assault and battery charges against Caston. First time any African American had challenged white violence in Amite County. August 31st, 1961, Billy Jack Caston was tried in Liberty, Mississippi on these assault and battery charges. Caston testified that Moses had picked the fight with him and that 6 white witnesses concurred with Caston's testimony. Moses also testified, but he was told by the sheriff to leave the courthouse before the jury returned its verdict because he could not guarantee Moses' safety. Caston was acquitted. On September 5th, 1961, Bob Moses and Travis Britt, another SNCC worker, accompanied 4 Amite citizens to the Liberty Courthouse in order to register to vote, and this group was also accosted by a group of white men in the hallway of the building. This time Britt was the recipient of the beating by several of the men and was beaten until nearly unconscious. Voter registration work gets started in 1961 in southwestern Mississippi. Herbert Lee, a farmer in Amite County and charter member of the NAACP in Mississippi, attended voter registration classes and was a driver for Bob Moses around the area of Liberty, Mississippi. On September 25th, 1961, Lee was delivering cotton to a cotton gin in Liberty when he was approached by his longtime neighbor and sometime friend, Mississippi State Legislator E.H. Hurst, who demanded a conversation with Lee at gunpoint, presumably about Lee's involvement with voter registration agitators. Lee responded that he would in no way have any conversation until Hurst put the gun away. Hurst ran toward Lee's truck and in front of a dozen witnesses in broad daylight shot Herbert Lee dead. One of those witnesses was another African-American farmer named Lewis Allen, and his eyewitness record of this murder would come back to haunt him. Later, at Herbert Lee's funeral, his wife approached Bob Moses and said point blank to him, "You killed my husband. You killed my husband." Bob Moses recounted later, "I had no answer for her." Tom Hayden, a student activist in the 1960s, wrote the following in a 2003 article which appeared in The Nation. A farmer named Herbert Lee had been shot in broad daylight by a white Mississippi elected official. A witness to Lee's murder, Lewis Allen, became a marked man. He was killed 2 years later. Bob Moses took Herbert Lee's death very personally. Lee had drawn venomous attention by driving Bob around the back roads looking for volunteers. Bob himself had been badly beaten on the head and face by the son-in-law of the man who shot Herbert Lee.
One of the farmers down there was killed, Lewis Allen, and
He was killed. He was said to be a witness in another murder trial, hadn't he?
that in fact, in the other murder trial was the trial which grew out of the voter registration that summer in 61. And there were several acts of violence. First was my getting beat. A week later, another one of the workers got beat. And we called off the drive, and about a month later, this farmer got killed, which led to Lewis's participation in the trial. He had to testify. And he wanted to tell the truth, and he told the truth to the FBI, but the local authorities. He told them what they wanted to hear. And so now,
Excuse me, he told the local authorities what they wanted to hear, but told the FBI the truth.
Mm-hmm. And we believe that the FBI leaked it to the local authorities, and some of the sheriffs, the deputy sheriffs, came out, and told him, Lewis, what they had learned.
This being Lewis Allen again.
Lewis Allen again. And they have been picking at him ever since. That was in September '61. At one point, the deputy sheriff broke his jaw, and that deputy is now sheriff. And then they killed him.
How was he killed?
With a shotgun. And they, whoever it was, laid in wait for him in some bushes next to his wire fence. And it was at nighttime. He was coming back, and he had to get out of the truck to unhook the fence, and when he got out, they just shot him.
Has there been an arrest on that?
No arrest.
Inspired by the freedom rides that were coming through interstate bus travel, several students from the local high school, Berglund High School, staged a sit-in at the Macomb bus station. Brenda Travis, Robert Talbert, Ike Lewis. They were arrested and remained in jail from August 30th, which was the date of the sit-in, until October 3rd. After they were released, they learned that they had been expelled from their high school. On October 4th, 115 high school students walked out of school in response to these expulsions and in response to the murder of Herbert Lee. SNCC didn't have any organizing role in that walkout, but they were anxious to support these students. Bob Moses, along with 11 others, including Chuck McDew, Curtis Hayes, Hollis Watkins, they were all arrested on the charge of disturbing the peace as a result of the high school march and contributing to the delinquency of minors. And from that Magnolia jail, Bob Moses wrote a letter. And in that letter, he said, "In the words of Judge Brumfield, who sentenced us, we are, quote, cold calculators, end quote, who designed to disrupt the racial harmony, parentheses, harmonious since 1619, end of parentheses, of Macomb into racial strife and rioting. We," he said, "are the leaders who are causing young children to be led like sheep to the pen to be slaughtered. Robert," he was addressing me, "haven't some of the people from your school been able to go down and register without violence here in Pike County?" I thought to myself that Southerners are most exposed when they boast. He concludes his letter by these words: "This is Mississippi, the middle of the iceberg." Hollis is leading off with his tenor voice. "Michael row the boat ashore. Alleluia. Christian brothers, don't be slow. Alleluia. Mississippi's the next to go. Alleluia." This is a tremor in the middle of the iceberg from a stone that the builders rejected. Meanwhile, the Berglund High School students, all of whom had been arrested for their walkout of school, they continued to stage protests in front of the school. The principal threatened expulsion for any student who didn't return, whereupon the students promptly turned in their books and left the school grounds. SNCC set up a temporary school for these students for a few weeks until Campbell Junior College in Jackson, Mississippi, agreed to continue their education. Bob Moses was released from jail in early December and shortly afterwards left Macomb, Mississippi for Jackson to be closer by these dislocated students. In the late winter of 1962, Bob Moses wrote a letter to the SNCC office in Atlanta. And in it he wrote, "We will scuffle like hell to get as many poll taxes paid as possible in the next 6 weeks while the hunting season lasts. After the hunting comes the killing. And if we're all dead, I want to be cremated and snuck into the next sun-circling satellite for my last rites." In 1962, native Mississippian Sam Block is recruited to work for SNCC in Greenwood, Mississippi, along with Bob Moses. On August 17th, 1962, Sam Block and other colleagues, Levon Brown and Lawrence Gaio, are on the second-story field office of SNCC in Greenwood at midnight. Sam Block calls Bob Moses Collect in Cleveland, Mississippi, which is about an hour away, to report police cars and white people driving up and down the street in front of the office. Moses calls the Federal Justice Department seeking protection and is told to call the local FBI. Sam calls back to Moses and says police cars are gone. Whites are out of their cars with guns and chains standing out in front of the office. Bob Moses made the drive back to Greenwood, arriving at 3:30 or 4 a.m. to find the office empty and ransacked and vandalized. Apparently, the SNCC workers crept out of the front windows as the mob came up the back stairs and climbed out onto the roof of an adjacent building and down a local TV antenna. Bob Moses, at that point, enters into the office, lays down on a cot established for sleeping in the SNCC office, and as Eric Berner describes in his biography of Bob Moses, went to sleep. In 1963, violence against voter registration activity continues to mount, and SNCC is under duress. On February 25th, 1963, Jimmy Travis is shot while driving from Greenwood to Greenville, Mississippi. Bob Moses, the passenger sitting beside Travis, took control of the car. Travis survived after surgery removed a bullet lodged behind his spinal cord and his neck. 13 bullets sprayed the car, with 2 hitting the neck and shoulder of Travis.
We actually began to spread out across the Delta in the 62-63 year. And so we were having a meeting. Randolph Blackwell had come over from Atlanta, and it was a meeting about voter registration, and we were taking him to Greenville from Greenwood. We were meeting in Greenwood, and we got grease gun, right, on the highway just before you hit Valley, Mississippi Valley, the state school. And there were 3 of us up front, Jimmy Travis, myself, and Randolph Blackwell. And so I'm in the middle, Jimmy cries out, and he's hit, and I reach over and hit the brakes, and we go in the ditch and stop. He's caught a bullet. So the next couple of days, first we get Jimmy to the emergency room in Greenwood, and then he gets down to Jackson. And then I come back, we are all going to meet in Greenville, and we decide to respond by bringing all of our people on voter registration to focus on Greenwood. So the whole SNCC staff comes to Greenwood.
We worked all of March, and as was to be expected, there was more violence. Sam Block and Willie Peacock were shot at in front of the office one night as they were parked, having come back from the church where they were getting together a clothes shipment. White men drove up close by the car, took a shotgun and blasted through the windows, so close that the pellets didn't have a chance to spread out, and luckily none of the 4 people in the car were injured. About a week later, a group of white men shot into a group of Negroes coming out of the Negro Theater. And then finally, late in March, One of our workers, George Green, was shot at just as he entered his house, having returned home late at night from work in the office. That next morning we gathered on the church steps at Wesley Methodist Church in Greenwood and started singing.
Get on board, children, children, get on board. Children, children, get on board. Children, children, let's fight for human rights.
And we sang and we sang and we sang. And people gathered around, and finally we sang "We Shall Overcome" in a big circle. And I talked to them and explained to them why I thought we needed to walk downtown to do two things: to protest to City Hall about the shootings, because any time unlicensed cars drive around the town and subsequently shoot at Negroes with white people in the car, the police have to be implicitly involved. It doesn't seem to me possible that unlicensed cars with white men in them can drive around the Negro community and cause violence and the police don't know about them. So we were going to protest to the police at City Hall and then go on to the courthouse to register another type of protest and try and register to vote. We never got to the courthouse. We were met at the police station with police dogs. They told us to turn around or the dog would be turned loose on them.
Thank you, Jeff McArn, for your contribution of this presentation. Please note that this is part 1 of Jeffrey's 2-part presentation on Bob Moses. Tomorrow, February 18th, 2022, you will be able to view part 2 on our website and YouTube channel, so please check it out and don't miss out on the rest of the presentation with more experiences in Bob Moses' life. In the meantime, please help us by completing a brief survey available at the link on your screen and also in the video description box. Your feedback will help NAHOF receive funding and help plan future projects. Additionally, please contact NAHOF with any questions and if you're interested in learning more about the organization and its work. Once again, thank you, Jeff McArn, for donating your time and contributing to this program. And thank you, the audience, for joining us on this educational journey, Black History Matters. We hope to see you at our next presentation.